Welcome to the Athletic Fantasy Baseball Show. It is Friday, May 6th. Derek Van Riper here with El Melchior live on YouTube. So be sure to drop us a question if you're watching us live and you have a waiver question for this week. It is a great weekend for the waiver wire, perhaps the closest thing we will get to a fab-a-palooza. So if you've been holding on to some cash, you got some interesting players that you want to pick up, this would be a week to consider making a few more moves than usual, Al. And we talked about it a little bit on the prospect show earlier in the week. There were a few highly performing AAA players on the brink coming up. I think at that point we knew MJ Melendez had been called up by the Royals. Jose Miranda was already up for the Twins. And in the time since we spoke on that show on Tuesday, Carlos Correa suffered a broken finger, which has led the Twins to also bring up Royce Lewis. So a lot of Twins talk as we get started today, but a few prospects right off the cuff that are really interesting in situations where both Jose Miranda and Royce Lewis are available. I'm curious to know how you're prioritizing them, especially in leagues where we have a free agent bidding process.
Well, I think now that we know that Lewis is coming up, or in fact, I think he has been called up now. In most cases, I think I'd be prioritizing Lewis just because of the stolen base appeal. Miranda, I'm sure is just up to stay now unless he's really horrible. So it depends on need. If I'm set with stolen bases, there is a scenario where I think Miranda has a little bit more appeal, but in the proverbial vacuum, it is Royce Lewis for me.
Yeah, we've seen about a week's worth of playing time so far from Miranda. I think the question I have is, with Royce Lewis, does he stick as a super utility guy if he plays well? Once Correa's back and healthy, that's obviously Correa's spot. But we've seen Lewis move around back in the Arizona Fall League a couple of years ago. So I think there's at least a path that could open up for him because of his defensive versatility. I think third base has been a bit of an unsettled situation for the Twins this season. Gio Urshela plays there quite a bit. He's more glove than bat right now, so maybe they'd be willing to move him around or use him as more of a utility guy. There's just a lot of fluidity here. I think there's also some questions about Miguel Sano. Once he's eventually back, what's his role going to look like? And it sounds like it's going to be a pretty lengthy absence for him in the wake of knee surgery. So there's playing time to be had, and this is a pretty good offense. So the value for these guys, both Lewis and Miranda, could end up being shallow league value sooner rather than later. But I'm with you. I do prefer Lewis of the two. I do think the bidding is probably going to be for Lewis north of a 15% of a full budget. I think it's going to be a significant bid that it takes to get him because people have been sitting on money. They don't necessarily see a lot of other great prospects they're going to wait for. A lot of the pitchers that we talked about on Tuesday, that's probably going to be the next big wave of call-ups. Names like Max Meyer and Grayson Rodriguez, Matthew Liberatore, those types of players are going to be the other big ticket players in the weeks ahead. Miranda already up to 41% rostered on CBS, Lewis at 28%. But they're not the only prospects getting the opportunity to play at the big league level right now. MJ Melendez is up for the Royals, Al, and I'm just wondering, how much playing time are you expecting for him? Because when we looked at this team at the beginning of the season, the crowding they had behind the plate with Sal Perez coming off of a career year at first base with Carlos Santana there on the final year of his contract. It led to some questions about how you could make the pieces fit with guys like Melendez, who's certainly a catcher, maybe could play other spots, and then even Nick Prado and Vinny Pasquantino, who are not part of the mix right now.
Well, right now, I think there's a lot of playing time to be had for Melendez, and what we've seen, in just the couple of games so far, is you saw Melendez start behind the plate with one game and Perez DH, and then they flipped. And I'm not saying that we're going to see them, doing that every day, and that obviously Sal Perez is an everyday player, but Melendez, I don't expect him to be an everyday player, but I think he can get pretty close. I think the issue is, like you said, that the roster could get more crowded when the Royals start calling up other prospects. And at that point, maybe a little later in the season, I would be shocked if they just let Carlos Santana go this early in the season, but maybe we get to midseason and that's what happens. So I'm not too worried about that far ahead. But I think for the next few weeks, I would expect Melendez to get, 4 or 5 starts at least every week.
Yeah, as advertised, a lot of hard contact so far for MJ Melendez. Just a handful of batted ball events. I think he's got 6 in the brief time that he's been with the Royals. 4 hard hit balls over 95 miles per hour. Given the power he showed last year in the minors, not really a big surprise. I think it's more of a question of Lewis versus Melendez if you're looking at all of the hitters that are at the top of the list this weekend. In a two catcher league, especially, I could see Melendez carrying a very similar 15+% sort of bid. The question for me is, how interested do you want to be in a single catcher league? Is he viable? Is there enough ceiling and playing time to justify chasing Melendez in a 10 or 12 team league where you only have to start one catcher?
I really think there is. And in the weekly waiver report that I do for the Athletic, that's, I put a recommended bid in there. Now, I didn't go 15% on anybody in this group, partly because of the volume. But obviously people can prioritize, based on their needs and their preferences. But with Melendez, I did put a, recommended bid for 10 and 12 teamers, because I think given the power potential he has, he just automatically cracks that, like second tier below the top three or so. Because again, we talk about it almost every week. There's a huge drop off after that. And I would put Melendez on the top side of that line.
A few other names that are relatively new to their big league rosters. Juan Yepez getting a chance to play in St. Louis. I'm just curious how you think they're going to handle his situation, because it seems like one of Dylan Carlson or Corey Dickerson has to play a lot less if Yepez is going to get a true opportunity to play close to every day in St. Louis right now.
I think it is some of both of those players losing playing time, but probably Dickerson much more. And again, being the big side of a platooner he had been. And we've seen that with Yepez so far, starting in place of Dickerson in one game and in place of Carlson in another. So maybe Carlson at this point is just relegated to facing righties. I can't imagine that it would be a strict platoon, but I think he does lose a little bit of playing time. And I think Corey Dickerson, I can't conceive of the situation where he's anything but a bench player at this point. Doesn't make any sense.
Jarren Duran is supposed to be back up for the Red Sox. I know there's some pretty nasty weather throughout the Northeast, so it might not be on Friday, depending on how that all plays out. But he's coming back up, and I think the thing the Red Sox have done that's really surprised me so far this year, Al, is they've leaned on Jackie Bradley Jr. a lot more than I thought they would. I thought JBJ was going to be more of a true fourth outfielder to begin the season. I thought they brought him back just to have a great defensive center fielder on the bench, and he started 21 of 26 games for the Red Sox so far. I think you can look at his offensive production and very easily tell yourself a story that the fourth outfielder role is probably in play if Duran comes up and hits. Is Duran going to be stuck on the big side of platoon at this point? Is that kind of the short-term expectation for how they'd use him?
I think that's maybe the worst case scenario, again, unless he just really flails. We could come up with our own stories about what the Red Sox were thinking here, but I had read a report about this call up of Duran, and somebody in the organization saying that, they really wanted to give him some run at AAA just to get comfortable, and they weren't looking to rush him, and they're not looking to rush Tristan Casas. Maybe that's a signal that we see Casas soon too. But they could have signed Bradley and said, okay, let's see how this rolls. Maybe he'll produce more than we're expecting. He wound up, even when you include the defensive aspect of his game, still wound up being a literal replacement level player up to this point. So I feel like there's very little, if anything, to lose for the Red Sox to just turn Duran loose and maybe let him play literally every day.
Yeah, it could be a possibility for him. I look at the AAA numbers, not surprisingly, very good again in the brief time that he was there this season. 7 for 8 as a base stealer in 15 games. You go back to last season when he opened the year at AAA, he was 16 for 19 on the base pass in 60 games, popped 16 home runs during that time as well. A lot has been made of adjustments he made during the 2020 season at the alternate site to his swing to unlock some more power. We haven't seen it at the highest level yet. He slugged .336 during his debut last year in 33 games with the Red Sox. But the fact that he was doing it again, and it's not the PCL, gives me some hope that we can see a step forward from Duran. I also think he's one of those guys, like the 35% K rate that he posted last year was a big surprise. Even with all the caveats, knowing that the jump from AAA to the big leagues might be as big right now as it's ever been, I think there are a few ways it can go right. Even if he's stuck in the bottom third of the order, if he strikes out a little less, walks a little more, you're probably getting some cheap steals. Where does the bid go for you with Duran? I mean, if we're assuming a bottom third of the order lineup placement for now, but the possibility of some speed and a little bit of power, it's not a bad player to take a chance on, at least in 15 team leagues, but possibly eventually in 12s.
Yeah, but I'm not going to go as aggressively for Duran as I would for Yepez or as I would for Royce Lewis. Partly what you just alluded to, maybe some cheap steals. He had 3 attempts with the Red Sox last year, and that was after, stealing a healthy number of bases in AAA. So maybe I read too much into that, but it does make me worry that that's not going to translate in him getting the green light often enough. And I don't know how much else is going to translate to make up for that. So I would still bid probably up to 20% on him in 12 teamers, probably looking at more like 60% in 15 teamers, but I'm certainly not going on the level that you were talking about before for some players like Yepez and Lewis, and talking about double digit percentages.
Let's move on to a few other players that are available in some shallow leagues and probably shouldn't be available in those formats. A few names that have really caught my eye. Rowdy Tellez only rostered in 62% of CBS leagues. Looking at the playing time in Milwaukee, Keston Hiura occasionally plays second base against the lefty, so we've seen Rowdy move away from being in a strict platoon over the course of this season. Of course, mashing so far. I had a huge game earlier this week in that blowout win over the Reds. Is there any reason why Rowdy Tellez shouldn't be more like 90+% rostered on CBS right now, given the way the Brewers are using him and what he's doing with that opportunity?
I don't really think so because, that's been the reason in the past that he was in strict platoons. The playing time situation wasn't secure. And at least I don't have any numbers in front of me to back this up. My perception, maybe because of getting him in the past and him not performing the way I expected, but maybe being a streaky hitter. But yeah, I mean, this is a month into the season with him producing at a really high level. So I think at this point, other than maybe the very shallowest leagues, Tellez needs to be picked up this weekend.
Yeah, 50% hard hit rate early on this season for Rowdy Tellez, and that lineup looking a little bit better than it did a season ago, even if there are still a few flaws that need to be fixed in Milwaukee between now and possibly making a playoff run. I was surprised to see Brendan Rodgers popping up on the wire in a few leagues, realizing that he's had a pretty rough first month, but he's showing some signs of breaking out of it. I think the thing for me with Brendan Rodgers is that he's got a path to a higher spot in the order in Colorado as soon as he heats up. Like, this is not a situation where you're looking at him and saying the offense is loaded. How could he possibly crack the top 3 or the middle third? I think it's just a matter of time before Rodgers is in that prominent spot again.
So yeah, the question is he going to be able to sustain enough production to be picked up where he isn't already heavily rostered? And you're right. Yes, since coming back, he's had a few 2-hit games. So we're certainly seeing more hitting from Rodgers than we saw earlier in the season. The thing is, if you've got a need at second base, I could see where Rodgers might be worth a flyer. Again, a pretty low bid, but just, take a chance on him. Shortstop is so deep that if that's your need, I don't really see the point shortstop or middle infield. But yeah, I guess I'm a little skeptical, but I think, again, if you have a need at second base, that maybe Rodgers is worth trying out for a couple weeks.
I've got a speed-centric toss-up for you. I'm really curious what you do in a situation where, and these exist, where Ramon Laureano, who's rostered in just over 40% of CBS leagues, Harrison Bader, similarly rostered, and Jarren Duran, who's rostered about half as much as those two guys. If all 3 were available, you're playing the speed game. Bader's been running quite a bit to begin this season, has a 92% playing time share just in terms of games started so far this year, and he's starting to creep up in the order. Dylan Carlson sinking, Harrison Bader rising just a little bit. How would you stack up those 3 outfielders in your quest to find some speed for one of your last outfield spots?
Because of the stat that I mentioned a few minutes ago about Duran only getting 3 attempts last year, I would put him third out of these 3. Bader would actually be a pretty clear number 1 priority for me. As you mentioned, the playing time for him, the volume of steals, batting in a good context for run production. Laureano, obviously, him just being in that ace lineup. Granted, he'll be in a prominent place in it, but being in that A's lineup is going to be something that's going to depress his value all by itself. So that would be my order: Bader, Laureano, and then Jarren Duran.
That Ramon Laureano suspension, by the way, wraps up this weekend. So definitely the time to go out and get him if he happens to be available in your league. I also included Mike Moustakas as part of the shallow bat. And shallows it's really open to interpretation. I think we're usually talking about 12 teams or less for a lot of these players in terms of the interest level. Moustakas is probably more for 15 teams and deeper, so kind of bridges the gap to our other group of hitters that we're going to talk about. He lost some time on the IL with a biceps injury, but he started every game but one during his time that he's been healthy so far this season. He's moved up in the order with Joey Votto on the IL, among others, for the Reds. They are just decimated with injuries right now. I still think there's a chance there's one more productive year coming from Mike Moustakas on this dismal Reds team, thanks to a skill set that ages reasonably well at the plate and a park, of course, that boosts up homers.
Yeah, and for that reason, the 115 team league where I do have Moustakas, I've been hanging on with him. I certainly have considered him as a cut the last couple of weeks, but I do have been hanging on with Mike Moustakas there. So if he is out there and somebody else cut him, then I think he's a reasonable pickup and definitely can add him in that affordable category as well.
20% rostered on CBS. So yeah, definitely falls more into that 14 plus team mixed league category at this point. Joker writes in, Tommy Pham recently hit the wire in his league, and he's been underwhelmed by Brandon Marsh's projections from the Bat X. Would it be a good idea to pick up Pham and drop Marsh, especially if Joker is looking for steals?
That's a tough one. And Pham, by the way, was going to be in the column this week, but it was so loaded with players that he didn't quite make the cut. So I do recommend picking up Pham. Dropping Marsh is kind of tough, though. I'd have to say no. And I have to think there's probably somebody else on the roster that you could lose to pick up Pham.
It is tough because I think with Brandon Marsh, the Joe Adell demotion has stabilized his playing time quite a bit. And we're seeing the signs of power growth that we're hoping for. I mean, coming off of shoulder surgery last season, Brandon Marsh only slugged 356. The K rate's still a little high at 35%, but that Angels lineup is really good. So the counting stats should be there. You get the power, you get a little bit of speed. If it were the only move I could make, and I'm assuming it's a short list of possible cuts, I think I would take Pham over Marsh. It's not a move that you have to make, but it's a move that you can make. I think the question is, how much do we trust Pham to keep on running? Do we think he's still going to get to the 15 to 20 steal range this season? If we think there's some reason that he's going to fall short, then that could swing it too, given the categorical needs here. But very close. Tommy Pham, I think, is one of the most difficult players for me to analyze because projections tend to like him a lot, and he tends to underperform those projections just slightly. But yet you keep getting pulled in because he does a lot of things really well. He controls the zone well. He doesn't chase a lot of pitches outside the strike zone. And being in Cincinnati, just like Moustakas, it's a park that's going to boost up his power. He's going to take advantage of that probably for the next 2.5 months or so before there's a possible trade to some other team. But even that might bring good counting stats because it might be a regular spot with a contending team if he's playing well. So thanks for that question, Joker. Hopefully that was helpful, even though we were split on what we would do in that situation. Another question here from Dusty. Would you pick up Luis Urias and drop Nelson Cruz in a 10-team head-to-head categorical league without a keeper element?
Geez, this is, yeah. I'm going to say no again here, just because it feels 1 month in, as miserable as he's been, it feels a little early to be dropping Nelson Cruz.
Also tough, though, because we're seeing a few cracks in the profile. The plate skills still look really good. I think that's the most encouraging thing of all. Just 2 homers through 24 games. Power is just not there from a result standpoint. And even the underlying numbers have taken a hit. Hard hit rate down at 40%. It's the lowest it's been for Nelson Cruz in the entire StatCast era. Not a surprise. You lower the hard hit rate, the barrel rate comes down too. This is the first time he's had a barrel rate that's not double digits. He's at 8% so far this season. So that's another move. Just like the last question, I'm looking at it and I'm saying, I think you could do it. I don't think you have to do it. I think Urias is a big part of that Brewers offense. I think he's going to play as much as he can possibly play as long as there's no setbacks with his hamstring. So maybe they're going to be a little careful with him in the short term, but I think longer term, he could be a max volume player for us. Let's get to a few more deep league bats. And I want to talk about Edward Olivares. Is it happening, Al? He's 11% rostered on CBS. He has led off 3 consecutive games this week and even starting against right-handed pitching. That was my concern. We talked about him last week. They had brought up Kyle Isbell as well. If they were going to go the platoon route, that could work against Olivares. It doesn't seem like that's going to be the case.
No, not based on the past week or so. Very regular play for Olivares. And as you mentioned, leading off the last 3 games, or actually, sorry, last 4 games. So yeah, I mean, I love this situation. That was always the thing that you and I have brought up whenever we talked about Olivares is he going to stay up and is he going to play regularly? And so it's an opportunity for him to maybe compile some stolen bases, for him to actually make a difference in terms of batting average. I'm not sure I'm buying into the power that we saw from Olivares to AAA last year, because that's generally not been, one of the parts of his profile that's really stood out. But batting average, runs, and steals, that's a pretty nice package right there. Maybe not enough for me to be bidding anything in 12 teamers, but anything deeper. Yeah, I'm going to try to be adding Olivares this weekend.
Is there that much of a difference between Olivares and Jarren Duran?
That's a real good question. I think Duran actually has the clearer path to sustained playing time. Maybe I trust the power from Duran just a little bit more, which is not to say that I trust it entirely. But no, I think you're right. I think there's not that much difference.
Because the hit tool, I mean, the K rates have been low, even in the up and down nature of the playing time that Olivares has had so far. And he's got that prominent spot in the lineup for now. I would agree. The long-term assessment, it's easier to see Duran sticking, and maybe we still have some hangover effect from the up and down nature of Olivares' time with the Royals last year. But if he's still out there in your league, I think he's kind of pushing his way into that possible 12-team league consideration, with this role being a leadoff role and with those opportunities coming against righties. I also think Taylor Walls is pretty interesting. He's getting a lot of opportunities for the Rays, only 7% rostered on CBS, 9 consecutive starts as we enter the weekend. I know Wander was a little bit dinged up during that span, but Walls plays multiple infield spots. He already qualifies at shortstop and third base in most leagues, and it seems like if everyone's healthy and everyone who's usually in the lineup plays, Walls is the primary third baseman, even though they like to mix and match so many spots in Tampa Bay.
Yeah, just gives you a little bit of everything, and if the playing time is there, it's a great context, I guess, because he, to me, doesn't stand out in any one particular way. That he's either not somebody I've been bidding on, or he's far down on the contingency list. And honestly, this week, I don't think I'm going to be alone in stacking him way down that list too, just because of all the options. But he'd be a player that I'd be happy if I do miss out on the big names and I get him for a really nominal bid. I'd be happy with that.
I think the glove drives the playing time. He's got a pretty good eye at the plate. We've seen a lot of walks during his big league career. I'm curious to see if he can get the K rate down a little bit more. You would generally expect that for a guy that doesn't swing many pitches outside the strike zone. Probably a cheap speed play that can run into a little bit of power, and that versatility is always nice if you're in a situation where you can make multiple changes per week. I got to bring up a Nando guy today, Yadiel Hernandez. He's been talking about him for 3 years, probably, on under the radar, and I've always worried there just wasn't enough playing time. Universal DH helps a lot, and it seems like they're cooling on Lane Thomas quite a bit too. Now we're seeing Yadiel Hernandez really kind of take over a spot in the middle third of the order. He started 9 of the last 10 games entering the weekend. So this looks like a great call on Nando's part, and I'm curious if you think it's sustainable.
I do, just because you look at the Nationals roster, and it's not really shocking to see that Lane Thomas would go back to a 4th outfielder's role. That opens up this opportunity longer term for Hernandez. And I mean, to me, his appeal is all about that opportunity for playing time and him hitting right in the middle of that order, because I don't expect him to be a big power source, but I would expect that he'll hit for average and get on base enough that hitting in that part of the lineup that you'll get some run production along with the batting average.
Yeah, I like this setup a lot. I know you're not really expecting much in terms of speed. He's got 4 steals in 142 big league games. It's kind of selectively picks his spots a little bit. It's fine. If he's going to hit for a good average and provide power and run production, which he can do from that spot, I think it's a top heavy lineup, as we said many times before for the Nationals. If you're going to hit in the heart of that order, good things can absolutely happen. So happy for Nando that he appears to be right about Yadiel Hernandez getting this opportunity with the Nats right now. How about Brandon Drury? Didn't people used to like Brandon Drury? Like, he's getting a chance right now in Cincinnati, and part of it's all the injuries, but part of it's that they kind of like what he's doing, I think, with the underlying numbers. If you take a look at some of the production to this point, it's a K rate just over 20%. It's actually slightly better than a league average line, even though it's a 231 average with a 271 OBP. He has popped 4 home runs so far. In deeper leagues, maybe you're looking at the schedule and trying to find times when he's going to be at home for a couple of series, but I'm curious if you think you can find excess playing time from Drury on a bad team and a guy that's also moving up in that order.
Well, again, that opportunity that's really what gives him some value right now. And I think that his power is legit, and that gets amplified by the games he plays at Great American Ballpark. I don't know that he would necessarily just be a homestand streamer for me, though. I mean, I think he does have some legit power. And my question is just one of, what if you do have the full complement there in Cincinnati? What happens to Drury's playing time? I think he's got an opportunity now to say something about that, but I think that you can get him with a small enough bid that you don't really have to worry about that. If you just wind up, playing him for the next 3 weeks or so, he might give you enough to actually help you out over the course of the season. But, like I said, maybe there's an opportunity he plays his way into a longer standing role.
Yeah, I'm definitely thinking about him as a cheap contingency option in 15-team leagues where available this weekend. And then we go back to Kevin Smith, who was pretty popular on this show, I think probably the first week of the season. He, of course, had a brief stint on the IL, is now back, and has started 4 of the last 5 games since coming off of the injured list. Lots of things can happen here, too. I mean, the A's could just say, we're done with Elvis Andrus and move on and open up another spot there. So the playing time could max out, hasn't maxed out yet. Interesting skills. Kevin Smith, among the players we've talked about on this episode, who in very limited time has a hard hit percentage above 50% this season. So I want to see more of what he can do. And as you pointed out, it's a great schedule for the A's this week. 8 games on the schedule.
That gives me a little extra urgency to bid on Smith this week, because that context is, as I've said before, and I'll probably say again before the end of the episode, it's not great, but the playing time, if not every day, it should be there enough that in this 8-game week, I think he probably will start at least 6 times. And so, yeah, he's a good streamer for this coming week. He's hit well, by the way, since coming back. So we're seeing more of the Kevin Smith that we were getting a little excited about back in week 1. We're seeing that now. The playing time is there, at least in the short term. Good week. So at minimum, a really, really nice streamer.
If I could get a Kevin Smith jersey and know that absolutely 0% of the proceeds went to John Fisher, I would consider doing it. But I don't think such a jersey exists, at least,
unfortunately,
not in stores nearby, unfortunately. Let's move on to some pitchers. I am surprised. We're going to get a couple Shadow League guys in first. I am surprised that Jameson Taillon is only rostered in 2/3 of CBS leagues. What am I missing? Like, what's preventing him from being rostered everywhere at this point?
That is the question that I ask in this week's waiver column. I was shocked at the roster rate. And it's not very high on ESPN either. So, I mean, the only explanation really is just that so far he's not been that much of a help in strikeouts, but that's never really been the case for Jameson Taillon. But he's for much of his career so far found ways to have value without being a big strikeout pitcher. And initially it looked like, and he may still have a 2-start week this coming up week with the Yankees being rained out on Friday night. I don't know how that might affect the rotation. I believe there's a doubleheader on Sunday. So Monday forward, it might just be as it looked originally. And he's an absolute must add. He's an absolute must add, period. But with 2 starts, there's extra reason to maybe, go that extra 1% or whatever on Taillon.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably mostly 10-team leagues where he's available, but if you're playing in a league like that and he's sitting out there, you talk about a guy that even if he only goes 5, he's got a great bullpen protecting his leads. He's got one of the league's best offenses providing run support. Taillon's changed the shape on some of his pitches. The control's been very good. He's done a good job keeping the ball in the yard. And I think part of the reason the K rate and the swinging strike rate are down a little bit, if you've made 5 starts this season and 2 have come against the Blue Jays, you've been challenged. You've faced a team that doesn't strike out a lot. He still has 10 Ks and 11 innings against the Jays this year. So there's reason to believe that there's one more level from Taillon. I love the control. It's been as good as it's been, too. It's just the skill that if he keeps that where it is, the Ks don't matter because there's nobody on base. So you're going to get a great whip from a player like that.
And I would just add that his roster rates indicate to me that he actually is out there in a lot of 12 teamers. So if you are in a 12 team league and you need a pitching upgrade, and most of us do, at least go check it out. Don't assume that Taillon is already rostered.
The other guy that's out there in a similar number of leagues is Garrett Whitlock. We just saw him make a great start against the Angels this week, and I really didn't know what to expect from him as a starter. I certainly liked what he was doing in a relief role a season ago. 9 Ks last time out against the Angels, 2 runs on 2 hits over 5 innings. It seems like he is stretched out pretty well. It was only 17 batters faced, so maybe he's not quite like a regular starter yet, but based on the skills we're seeing, I have to imagine that interest in him is going to spike even in these more shallow formats where he's still somehow available.
My only hope is that people will look at the Red Sox reticence to commit to him as a starter. And I read a piece just today where it stated that the team was not sure if they weren't going to put him back in the bullpen. And if enough people are aware of that, maybe you could take advantage of it, not bid as much as you would on some of the other players that we're talking about here and get him. And if he does go back in the bullpen, I mean, it's going to be for a high leverage role. It doesn't make any sense otherwise. So either you get somebody who so far has been outstanding as a starter, or get somebody who might actually pick up some saves. So I think it's pretty much guaranteed a win-win.
Yeah, I mean, I know those guys in a lot of deeper competitive leagues, long gone, won't be available, but just thought they were really interesting pitchers that could do a lot even in shallow leagues. So scoop them up if you're in a format like that and they're available. I saw that you had George Kirby listed on our rundown for today. Matt Brash went down. So if you've got Matt Brash in a redraft league, especially a redraft mixed league, he's probably someone you're thinking about dropping this weekend. Is George Kirby possibly a threat to replace Brash in the near future? He has not pitched at AAA yet, but being that they have an affiliate in the PCL, I don't think it's impossible that George Kirby could skip AAA or spend very little time there before eventually debuting at the big league level.
Well, Michael Beller and I talked to Corey Brock on Thursday on this very show, and Corey intimated that Kirby could skip AAA, and he he basically insinuated, and I've seen this in some written reports since, that Kirby's on a short list of pitchers that are being considered right now. So I think now's the time. I mean, and if he's not the replacement for Matt Brash, then I think the fact that he's apparently under consideration to be means we're going to see Kirby sooner rather than later. So yeah, I think this is the time to put the bid on him. And yeah, I think that Brash is absolutely droppable, not only because of the performance, not only because he's being sent down, but he's going down to prepare to be a reliever. So I think that Brash's 2022 value at this point is going to be nil going forward.
It was fun while it lasted. It was fun when he broke Eno's pitching model. It was fun to think about what might be. And maybe someday down the road, he'll get another chance as a starter. Maybe the command will improve eventually. But interesting that they're already moving him into the bullpen with that demotion to Tacoma. Let's talk about Josh Winder again. I think he came up on the show last week. He's getting a temporary opportunity in the Twins rotation. Sonny Gray nearing a return. Bailey Ober down for a little bit. Dylan Bundy just went on the COVID list. And I would say, Chris Archer is not necessarily locked in to a rotation spot. There's some good in the profile, but there's definitely some underperformance happening there too. So I think it's a critical stretch for Archer to secure his place in that Twins rotation. Are you taking a chance on Josh Winder now amidst all of this chaos in that Minnesota rotation?
Deeper league, I am, and already have in some. But I think, yeah, if he's still out there in your 15 teamers this weekend, I think he's worth a flyer. I wouldn't, go more than maybe about 2%, partly because of the lack of job security there. I mean, you could have all three of those starters that you mentioned possibly making starts this week over Bundy and Gray. And where does that leave room for Josh Winder? But I think that he's good enough that maybe he somehow does stick, like you say, maybe with a demotion to the bullpen for Chris Archer. But I also think that the ceiling isn't so high for Winder that you got to break the bank, or that you need to pursue him in 12 teamers. So I think there's this gray area where he fits in that you make an effort to get him, but if you can't, you can move on.
I think it's going to take more than a min bid to do it, but you don't have to go overboard. Probably 3% of a budget will be enough, and you might be surprised at what you get depending on how things break with some of those other starters. Just not impossible that he pitches well enough to carve out a spot. They could also be a team that goes to a 6-man rotation for a little while too. I think they're built for it in a lot of ways with some of the injury risk that they've got cooked into that core group of starters. Let's get to a few shallow league streamers. 2 names that I didn't expect to put in this group are on my mind right now. Glenn Otto, home against the Royals, only 10% rostered on CBS. Again, I think in deeper formats, 15 teams and deeper, I think he's been scooped up already. If he hasn't been, he's absolutely viable in those leagues. I think he's viable for the upcoming week against the Royals. Even though the Royals don't strike out much, they're tied for 28th in WRC plus as a team. So this seems like a matchup where you can really take advantage of until some of those young players start to come up, and maybe MJ Melendez and Whit heats up, and you get a few of those guys going. Maybe Nick Prado or Pasquantino comes up later in the season too, and you get a good core in place. Until that happens, though, I think you got to take advantage of this Kansas City lineup.
No, I agree. At this stage, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm looking at strikeout rates and WOBA or WRC plus, but I'm looking at ISO because it's early enough that some teams overall, they're not performing well because of just some noise on BABIP rates and things like that. But I mean, if a team can't really do much damage with extra base hits, I feel like they're safe to stream against. So I do like the Royals for streaming against. And Otto's a pitcher who, I mean, he's shown the ability to get strikeouts, so maybe he can do it against a team that's not as prone to swing and miss.
Now here's one. Do you think I've miscast Tyler Wells as a possible shallow league streamer? He's only 4% rostered on CBS. He's on the road against the Tigers. The Tigers do have an above average K rate as a team, 24.3% entering play on Friday. They're tied with the Pirates in team WRC plus, tied for 24th in Major League Baseball. So I don't think we would disagree about the Tigers being a streaming target. I think we could disagree about whether or not you want to use Tyler Wells in a 10-team league where you're kind of churning through the wire for spots.
I'm not that intrigued. I mean, I get what you're saying about the matchup, and maybe it's just a question of just ratcheting him down to more of a deep league streamer. I think there's some appeal there, but in shallow leagues, I just think he can do a lot better. Wells hasn't been bad, but not a lot of strikeouts compared to some of the other options out there. So I just don't think he makes the cut in terms of shallow or maybe even medium leagues. 2 starts, two good. If you had 2 good matchups, maybe it's a different story there.
All right. Well, I will bump Tyler Wells into the medium league streamers group right now. We'll just say Otto's the only shallow league streamer that really jumped off the page at a low roster rate. There could be some others, but
I get you don't want Otto to be alone,
Yeah, right. It's not fun to be in your own tier for something like this. The other names in the medium league streams group, Adrian Hauser, who's rostered quite a bit more than all the other pitchers in this group at 38%, has to go on the road to face the Reds this time. But yeah, I'm afraid of the park. I'm not afraid of that current lineup. Even though there's a couple of hitters we talked about that we like, if they're still missing multiple regulars come next week, Hauser, I think, is right on the line of a shallow league stream because of how bad Cincinnati has been and because of how banged up they are. It's only the park giving me a second thought about it. I'm curious if you would go Hauser ahead of Wells if you're trying to rank these guys as priority pickups.
You know what? I'm going Wells.
See, this is how Wells got to where he was.
Yeah, no, makes sense. If you can't have just one shallow league guy, then I get it. There may be some others from this cluster I would bump ahead of Wells, but not Hauser. And I wrote about Hauser in a column just a few days back. 5 players who have had just really bizarre statistical profiles through the first month. And I think it was on this show, DVR, a week ago, I made some comment about, well, you can trust Hauser because if nothing else, he's going to get ground balls. Well, he hasn't been getting ground balls this year. Not at all. He's been giving up a lot of hard contact. And I basically said he's the Darren Ruff of pitchers. Like Ruff has been just crushing the ball and it is absolutely not showing up in his stats. Hauser's been getting crushed and it has not been showing up in his stats. And it's just a matter of time, even against a really, right now, very bad Reds lineup that does hit in a park where, maybe a mediocre hitter can take him out.
All right, so we keep him in the medium league group, and I think you've got Wells ahead of Hauser, even if you don't want to put Wells as close to Glenn Otto as I initially did. How about Drew Smyly on the road at Arizona? This Arizona team is showing pop, but they're a largely unproductive 3 true outcomes sort of lineup. It's kind of long ball or nothing for them. They do strike out quite a bit. They are below average in terms of actual offensive output. And Smyly, it seems like, might be pitching his way into your circle of trust.
He is, and it's because Drew Smyly is the new Adrian Hauser. He actually is getting ground balls, and the contact that he's allowing is soft. So he's becoming that guy, and the strikeouts are down. He's actually getting a lot of whiffs. He's just not getting a lot of freezes so far, and I think that's something that can kind of regulate itself and regress in a positive way. But as long as he continues to be getting grounders at the rate that he's been getting them, at this point, to me, I like Smyly a lot better than Hauser, and I would be inclined to put him in that group with Otto.
All right, so maybe Smyly goes to the shallow league streaming consideration group. We bring Wells into the medium group. Wells ahead of Hauser, Smyly ahead of Wells, Otto ahead of probably everybody, maybe the most long-term value of the bunch. And then we get to Martin Perez, who I think you and I over the last 3 years doing podcasts have talked about half a dozen times at least, because he'll go on a streak where he's pitching well, or he'll surprise us in a really difficult matchup, or maybe once in a while he tinkers and introduces a new pitch or something looks a little bit different. More often than not, when I look at Martin Perez, I see more of the same. I'm curious if you see something legitimately and sustainably different in the underlying numbers or the approach that would lead him to be anything more than a spot starter. The matchup is home against Kansas City. We talked about what the Royals don't do earlier in the show. I think he's fine for this matchup. I don't think I would pick him up with designs on keeping him. Is that a possible mistake?
Well, I mean, you can always adjust based on how he does against the Royals. I like him. I would put him on roughly a par with Drew Smyly. You look at, I mean, the matchup is definitely easier than the last couple he's had at Philadelphia, at Houston. In both of those starts, he went 7 innings, gave up just 1 run. That was against the Astros. And you were talking about, Perez in the past going on some extended, maybe for a few weeks, extended stretches where he turns in really good starts consistently. He's kind of building that right now. He has those 2 starts, Philly, Houston. Before that, he had a good matchup at Oakland, 6 scoreless innings against them. And he's just getting a lot of ground balls. And when Perez is going well, it's just a lot of soft contact. So no, I'm not seeing anything radically different from Perez. I'm just seeing the good version of him that we've seen before.
Fair enough. So usable, but definitely not a go get him and hold him because things are totally different. I wanted to make sure there wasn't something I'm missing, because I think when a player's been around as long as Perez, and when we have expectations that come with being one of the more highly regarded pitching prospects back when he was going through the minors, there's always that little glimmer of hope. Like Matt Moore has this for me too. We talked about him, I think, on Under the Radar this week a little bit, where you can try and talk yourself into it finally happening years later than expected with these kind of post hype sleepers or post hype prospects. I don't think that's where we're at with Perez. So use carefully. Then, of course, there's Rich Hill. Every time I look at his roster rate on CBS, it's lower than I expect. 7% rostered. It is a road start against Atlanta. Atlanta has Ronald Acuna Jr. back. Where are you at on Rich Hill where available? Is he in the mix of someone you'd at least consider if you're just looking for innings?
You were surprised by the roster rate. I was surprised by the top line results that he's been doing as well as he's been, but the peripherals are pretty bad. So I'm just out on Rich Hill, period.
Fair enough. We can scratch him from this list, maybe put him in the bottom of the deep league streamer consideration. I do think Vince Velasquez is worth bringing up on the show. A few weeks ago, when the White Sox made the decision to use Vince Velasquez as their fifth starter over Ronaldo Lopez when that spot opened up, I was surprised and with some curiosity of, I wonder what they see or what they've tweaked or why they're making that choice, just because I thought Ronaldo Lopez pitched really well when called upon last year, kind of working more in a swing role. And it's holding up pretty well so far for Velasquez. He looks passable in Eno's pitching model. I think he's just a tick above average across the board in terms of actual stuff and location and his overall pitching plus number. So in that regard, I think there's some reason to believe, and the results are starting to come around a little bit as well. His matchup for streaming purposes is against the Guardians, a team that really doesn't strike out that much, but he does catch them at home. So I'm just curious what you make of Vince Velasquez, because there's a little bit of what I was just describing with Martin Perez. We had some high expectations for him a few years ago. Injuries are a big part of why it hasn't happened yet. Do you see enough there to become interested? Because I see a higher K rate than we see with Perez. I see a better walk rate than we've seen in recent years, at least from Vince Velasquez. And I'm starting to talk myself into this maybe being something that can work, at least in deeper formats.
Yeah, I've been kind of thinking the same thing about Velasquez, and yeah, greater risk, greater reward than Martin Perez, because you've got the greater strikeouts. Now you've had the history of greater strikeouts, but you've also had the history of a lot of home runs from Velasquez. Again, pitching in a park where that can be a real liability. So, yeah, I think maybe he could even be bumped up a notch in terms of these categories. And yeah, against a team like the Guardians, maybe you're not getting a lot of strikeouts, but I'd feel pretty safe starting Velasquez in like a 14-team league with that matchup.
I'm surprised that when you look at the pitch mix and the velocity, not much has really changed for him, though. I would have expected an extra tick on the fastball or more changeups or something to be a lot different, but it looks kind of similar to what he's been trying to do for the last 2 seasons, maybe just locating a little more consistently and getting some good early season results from that. But he's gone from no to yeah, maybe at the very least. And that's not a place I thought we would go with Vince Velasquez just a month ago. Alex Fido has a start at Oakland, young Tigers pitcher, 3% rostered on CBS, some prospect appeal there. What are you doing with him, given how good that matchup might be?
I think it's still AL only for me, just because really the range of expectations is pretty great on this one. A lot of risk, a lot of options we're going through here, and ones that I'd certainly feel better with Velasquez, even though he's a pretty risky pitcher himself.
How about Jordan Hicks? The matchup is a home matchup against the Orioles, which I think is good. He's 31% rostered in CBS, so rostered more than the typical deep league streamer because of hope of getting saves earlier in the year and opportunities for him to start maybe have drawn some interest too, because the stuff's never been the problem. It's always been the command and the consistency. And of course, staying healthy is a big part of the story for him as well. Where are you at with Hicks? Is he stretched out enough where you're starting to think about him in matchups like this, especially at home? Or do you still see this as a fun experiment, but one that's very likely to hurt you if it doesn't go well?
I think it could hurt you. I would be more likely to go with him than Alex Faedo, but probably not to the degree of Vince Velasquez, because he does have the potential. Velasquez does, to go a little deeper into the start, give you more Ks, maybe a bigger chance of blowing up. But I think I'd take that chance. So yeah, for me, Hicks is pretty far down on the list right now.
Longest outing of the season for Jordan Hicks was his last time out on May 1st. 3 1/3 innings, 4 Ks, a couple of walks, a couple of runs. They were solo home runs that he allowed to that Arizona team. Shocker. That's how they score. They just hit home runs and do nothing else. But that's where I've been so far with Hicks, where it's like when I watch him, I'm excited because the stuff's nasty, but I just don't see him going 5 consistently enough where I want to actually throw him out there. I would actually love it if they committed to putting an opener in front of him. That would be something that would get me at least somewhat excited about him in deeper leagues, because then you'd have a path to wins. I just don't think you have that right now, even though this setup is really good. A couple of 2-start pitchers to get to, more for medium leagues, not really a lot of shallow league 2-start pitchers. Bad schedule for 2-start pitchers for the most part this week. We've got Austin Gomber at San Francisco, but then back home at Coors against the Royals, 32% rostered on CBS right now. And then we got Kyle Bradish on the road for 2 at St. Louis and at Detroit. Those are the only 2 that really jumped off the page as consistently available in 12-team leagues that I might actually think about picking up for the 2 steps.
To me, Bradish is a much, much better option than Gomber. He's got I wouldn't say a scary matchup, but definitely not a good matchup in San Francisco. We've talked about the Royals in relation to some other pitchers here, and might not do a lot of damage, but the Tigers are just a great matchup right now. So you figure, Bradish at least should give you a good start with that one. And Gomber, I know I've been a Gomber defender for a good chunk of the last couple of seasons. Right now, he's got a 22.4 CSW. And yeah, some of his other peripherals look pretty good, and they could get you kind of talked into starting him with these 2 starts. I don't see, with this many starts under his belt, I don't see how good things can happen for a pitcher with the CSW that low.
I think if I had to choose between the 2, I'd be more comfortable using Gomber this week. If I'm chasing volume and my ratios are already kind of stuck on the wrong side of the standings, I think I like Gomber more. I think with Bradish, I want to see him miss some bats before I start throwing him out there for 2 road starts. I think the Orioles are right to stick with him, give him some opportunities, see how things go. But I think if I had to pick one up and activate him, Gomber would get just the slight lean for me. I like the 4-pitch mix. I like that he gets 1 on the road. I know at San Francisco is where we got Gomber and got the T-shirts last year as part of a 2-step, disastrous. But then he ended up pitching really well when he was healthy from that point forward. So to me, slight edge to Gomber. I understand the appeal of Bradish long term. I just think it could be a bumpy road to get there. Humberto Castellanos makes the cut for a deep league 2-start pitcher. Home against the Marlins, home against the Cubs, 3% rostered. Everything we've seen so far, at least in terms of Eno's pitching model, paints him as this sort of location over stuff sort of guy. But I'm more willing to take a chance on that profile in these matchups, especially with both of these turns coming at home.
I am too. And Castellanos is a pitcher who, whenever I see him come up on the schedule, I just have written him off because he allows so much contact. I just thought there's really no upside there. But yeah, I took note of the really good start that he had against the Marlins this week. He gets the Marlins again next week. He also gets the Cubs. So 2-start week for Castellanos. And I took a deeper look into the profile, and yeah, he allows a lot of contact, but he's second right now in terms of average launch angle on flies and pop-ups. So I think we talked about Chris Young maybe on a recent podcast, or it's like a trivia question.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess Chris Young was kind of for a while there, like the king of high flies and pop-ups. And he would always have these like 250 BABIPs.
Amazing BABIPs. Yeah. Back when BABIP was king.
Yes. And Castellanos is the same sort of pitcher. So with a 2-step with matchups that don't really scare you, I think there's a lot to be gained there.
Yeah, it's deep leagues though. 15-team mixed leagues.
Oh yeah,
I mean most
it's
shallow.
It's
NL only. It's more like that for Castellanos than the shallow 10-12 mixed league. I mean, that's why we're talking about it at the end. I just want to be extra clear on that.
Yeah.
But there is something there.
Yeah, I mean, given that he's available almost everywhere, it's a relevant point.
A clear pitch and ditch option for those deeper formats. 2 guys in the high risk category that when you compare them to Castellanos or even Kyle Bradish, you kind of think, really? These guys are high risk and Kyle Bradish and Castellanos aren't? I'm just curious what you're doing this week in leagues where Michael Pineda and Kyle Hendricks are available. Pineda goes home against Oakland, home against the Orioles, and Hendricks is on the road twice at San Diego and at Arizona. What do you make of these 2 guys?
Pineda, I'm just flat out avoiding, which just I know probably seems sort of crazy. And I actually specifically made the point in the waivers column saying I actually would rather start Castellanos this week than Michael Pineda. He is completely outside the circle of trust with 2 of the best matchups that you could imagine in a 2-start week. I don't see any upside there at all, and a lot of downside. Hendricks, at least I could see in a deeper league, just letting him roll. if there's a lack of other options. But it wouldn't be beyond me to bench Hendricks this week.
I think if I had to start one, I like Pineda better since it's 2 at home and they're both good spots. I think Pineda and Castellanos are closer for me. I think I'd even probably go Pineda over Castellanos if I was trying to throw the Hail Mary and max out innings and steal 2 wins. But this is flying close to the sun. Yeah, as far as possibly damaging your ratios and, well, if you're flying close to the sun, probably your eyes as well. We should go to the closer corner here for a moment. I know interest in Ryan Helsley has been picking up recently. And part of that's that Giovanni Gallegos hasn't been his usual dominant self. So maybe the door is open for Helsley to emerge as a source of saves, depending on what happens there in St. Louis for the next couple of months. But what are you doing if you're chasing saves this weekend? Because I'm finding it to be another difficult weekend to throw darts that I'm excited about.
Yeah, same here. So I think more just by virtue of the lack of options that Helsley, if you're going to throw some money at potential saves, he's the best target probably right now. Uh, Also, maybe in Houston just because Presley's back, but his first game back wasn't a very good one. So who knows how that's going to develop? But then again, who would step in to share or take over saves if that were even going to happen? So I think kind of by default, Helsley's the one, and I have no expectation that he's going to become the sole closer in St. Louis, but it could maybe happen. And if you can not have to throw too much of your fab budget after him, might be worthwhile. I think, if I weren't really desperate for saves, I might actually look into just rostering Michael King because he's not going to give you saves, but he can still really help you with strikeouts and ratios with the way that he's pitching.
Yeah, it's a lot of names that when you look at this group, you just don't see clear paths. It'd almost take an injury over the weekend for some of these guys to become more viable. I think you're right to keep maybe holding in deeper leagues on the Houston alternatives to Presley. We want to see where that velocity goes these next couple of appearances. We want to see if he's effective. They could have to make a change. They just gave him that extension, so I think they prefer that he's the guy, and we'll give him plenty of chances to really kind of right the ship. The other name that I think is worth mentioning for shadow league purposes is Devin Williams, only because Josh Hader seems to be fine. The back strain that cost him a little bit of time shouldn't keep him out much longer or any longer. I just look at Williams as a clear-cut next guy up. It's really more for those shallow formats again. And he's pitched so well after a bumpy start. He's fine if you need to just plug him in as your last pitcher in some leagues. And I think that's something that occasionally gets overlooked. You sometimes have these short relievers that, that you don't think you can use unless they're getting saves. But I think Williams' skills are just high enough where you can get away with it once in a while.
Well, maybe he's kind of the midpoint between, going after a Helsley or going after a Michael King. This way you kind of get the best of both. Somebody who's certainly going to help you with strikeouts and ratios and can chip him with saves, even in the worst case scenario.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you there. A couple questions to get to before we go. Dusty would like our opinion on Zach Plesac. Is he a streamer or a keeper?
Streamer, maybe. Keeper, I would say definitely not. And I think the streaming possibilities are kind of few and far between.
Yeah, I think the problem we're seeing with Plesac, he doesn't miss enough bats. The control's not nearly as good as it was back in 2020 when everything was going right. And he's still giving up a decent number of home runs. So I think you really got to be careful with how you use him. Deeper league streamer for me is probably the tagline on the Zach Plesac movie poster at this point. One more question here. This one comes from Robert. In a 12-team 6x6 league, considering dropping Justin Turner for Ramon Laureano, Turner has a lot of blue on the Savant page, and his weak contact has really turned me off. Is this a smart move for some cheap speed? So the question really boils down more to, are you comfortable cutting Turner if you're going to go ahead and try and add some speed with Laureano?
I get it. I am personally not. And I think you can see my bias that first week of May. This is the third or fourth question we've had with a player that I would have drafted like in the middle of rounds. And it just feels a little bit early, maybe by a couple of weeks for me to give up on a player who just isn't putting up the numbers that we expected. So I would say a no on this.
This one feels a bit like the Fam Marsh question from a little while ago, where I look at it and I say, you actually could do this. Like, I don't think you're making a tactical error giving up on Justin Turner. Part of the reason why the K rate is off the charts high right now for him, relatively speaking, 21.3%. He's never struck out that much. 5.6% is the walk rate. That's the lowest it's been since he became a Dodger. So when he was a Met back in 2013, that was about as much as Justin Turner walked. The underlying numbers in terms of how hard he's hitting the ball, that's a concern. He's chasing more pitches outside the zone. I wonder if he's hurt. This is so broken so fast. It just makes me wonder if he's not healthy. And in a shallow league like that, if he starts to lose some playing time, the value can dry up pretty quickly. I'm also curious to see what the Dodgers want to do with Miguel Vargas, one of their top position player prospects. He could maybe come up later this year and play third base if they're not happy with Turner. So I think we're closing in on a point where people are going to have to make decisions like this. You don't necessarily have to do it right now, but I think you can do it if you're in a position like the one Robert is in. So another split. I feel terrible when we get asked a question and we're just on opposite sides because it feels like it's not very helpful. But at the end of the day, we want people to make their own decisions, and if there's a rational case to go one way or the other, we just hope to present that. So thanks to everybody who tuned in live. If you missed it live this week, 4 p.m. Eastern over on the Athletic Fantasy YouTube page each and every Friday afternoon. If you got questions during the show, you can always drop those in the chat. We're happy to answer those. On Twitter, you can find Al at AlMelchiorBB. You can find me at Derek Van Riper. Get a subscription to The Athletic for just $1 a month for the first 6 months at theathletic.com/fantasy baseball podcast. If you have that, you can check out Al's written waiver wire piece each and every Friday. Al also answers questions there too. So it's a lot of ground that we cover and plenty of other tools we have available and stories on the site that you could enjoy. $1 a month for the first 6 months, really a great deal. So be sure to get that if you have not subscribed already. That is going to do it for this episode of the Athletic Fantasy Baseball Podcast. Good luck with the waiver wire this weekend. We're back with you on Tuesday.